for our main topic this week on Mastering Dungeons, we have with us Dr. Jamie Madigan, author of the book, The Psychology of Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, and there's holding up a copy.
Holding up the cover.
Exactly. Nice. Looking good. Looking good. So, for people who might have jumped right into this episode and not watched the previous segment, Jamie, could you tell us again who you are and what have you done? What is it that you have done?
Constant question. My name's Dr. Jamie Madigan. I am a psychology PhD who writes and podcasts and otherwise talks about the overlap between psychology and games, computer and video games, and then also tabletop role-playing games like D&D. And a lot of it is like, what does the psychology literature have to say about why games are designed the way they are, or why are successful games designed the way they are? Why do players behave as we do when we play? And then even some of like, why are games marketed, sold, and priced the way that they are? So what is all the psychology behind that? So I've been doing that mostly over at psychologyofgames.com since like 2009. I started writing, blogging there, and then I came up with a book about the psychology of video games called Getting Gamers. Started a podcast, and then started writing more and more about tabletop role-playing games like D&D, because over that span of time, they were getting more and more popular. And I played since like the early 80s, but it started up in earnest back when 4E came out. And I was like, wow, this same approach would work for D&D. And tabletop games. And I say like the psychology of Dungeons and Dragons for marketing reasons, because it's the biggest, most recognizable game. So if you see that on a bookshelf, at the bookstore or on a webpage, you'll know what it is. But really, it's about all different kinds of TTRPGs and the psychology behind them.
Right. So other than being a big fan of role-playing games and obviously having a PhD in psychology, what prompted you to write this book right now?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it had to do with the growing popularity, because I figured there were a lot of people who would be interested in hearing about this sort of stuff. And just there are lots of questions that occurred to me, over my years of playing, of like, well, why is this like that? Or why is that elicit the reaction that it does? And why are these games built the way they are? And I started just kind of keeping track, and then thought that, another approach like I did in Getting Gamers, where each chapter is like a big question like that, of like, why do people role play? Why do people have misconceptions about dice rolls? What makes, a group work together and cooperate better? And just sort of started cataloging all of these questions, and then writing about them on psychologyofgames.com. So I'd write blog articles. And then, I put together a proposal for the book to see, if it would hold together as a coherent, like, concept idea. And I thought it did. And sent it off to my literary agent, and she eventually sold it. And I started working on it full time. Yeah. Okay. It was kind of a long process, because, I have a day job. And this was like a nights and weekends kind of thing. And, I think I came up with the idea and the proposal and sent that off in like October of 2021. Okay. And then agent started trying to shop it around to publishers, and finally landed one and sold it in October of 2022. So like a year later. And at that point, I had only written like 2 chapters, because generally for this kind of nonfiction book, you write like a very detailed proposal saying like, this is my platform, this is my audience, this is why you should publish my book, because I have a built-in audience that I could sell it to. And then you write maybe a couple of sample chapters. So I had done that. So once they sold it to a publisher, I started writing it in earnest, and then sent in the final transcript, the final manuscript, to my publisher in like December of last year of 2023. And then it just takes time to go through the traditional publishing process. And so it came out in like November of this year, 2024.
That's awesome. Wow. What a process.
Yeah. Could have done it more quickly if I worked on it full time, but if you have a dream like this and want to do something like that, find corners of your life to fit it in.
How did you choose what questions to put in the book and what to try to say with your book?
again, a lot of it came from personal experiences that I had, like playing games and things that I'd read and heard about, or things from like the history and the evolution of the game from earlier editions to the current ones. So I would, keep track, and I'm since about 2011, 2012, I've had like a really consistent group. And then I recently added a second weekly group. So I play on like Wednesdays and sometimes Fridays. Maybe we can get into the story of why that's only a sometimes on Fridays later. But I played a lot and just, like I said, kept track of all of these types of questions and thought they would make good blog articles. And then the blog articles get blown out into full length chapters and keeping track. But I tried to make sure that the questions I was answering are really relatable ones. So they're not esoteric and they're not necessarily driven by what's available like in the academic research, although there's tons of citations and references. There's 10 pages, 50 or so like journal articles and so forth that I reference. But it was always what's going to be relative or relevant to the people reading the book and playing the game. And then even on top of that, like what could they then take and apply to their game? Like lessons learned, like, oh, I can start thinking about this part of the game this way, or I can try describing the game this way or running these rules. So it was all about like what I knew and had been exposed to, what I thought I could support with scientific research and not just making stuff up out of whole cloth. Tried to minimize that. And then what is going to be relevant to people, and what are they going to be able to take away and apply to their own games, as opposed to just this being like an academic sort of exercise. It's much more, what can you do with this?
Awesome.
So if you are not a dedicated D&D player, or if you want people who aren't players to understand the game more, would this book sort of be a good bridge between what the gameplay is like and just a general idea of role-playing games?
I think so. I mean, it's mainly written for players and DMs or GMs, but I go out of my way to make sure that I explain concepts in ways that somebody who is only sort of familiar, or maybe somebody who's just listened to episodes of a Let's Play, for example, and never actually played themselves, maybe they're making that bridge, know what's going on. There's like a whole index in the back that talks about all of the terms. So I'm not precious about not using game terms. I'll talk about rolling with advantage. I'll talk about death saves and that kind of stuff, but it's always in context. And then there's the glossary at the back of the book to help people understand, if they need the help, what I'm talking about. But generally it's applicable both to players and game masters and anybody generally familiar with the concept of a TTRPG. A complete novice might need a little bit extra guidance, but
some of this information could be very valuable. Like you mentioned dice behavior before, and dice superstition is something you talk about. So what did you conclude about these ridiculous claims people make about their dice, and how can you help me with my cursed dice?
Yeah. So are there of you guys dice jailers? Do you have like a little jail that you put your dice in when they perform poorly?
I don't have dice jails, but I do always put, and I know at least one other player at my table does this, I always put the highest number up. Like as in a way of encouraging them, or maybe like I think that they'll settle in some way that generations from now my kids will roll nothing but maximum on their dice. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth a try. What's the downside? Yeah. So the chapter about dice superstitions and how we think about randomness and the psychology behind randomness was the first chapter I wrote, and it was in the proposal. It was included as a sample chapter in the proposal. And one of the reasons for that is that I think it's super relatable, right? Everybody has had that thought of my dice are cursed, or I'm due for a high roll because I've failed every roll up to this point. The DM is cheating because all of the kobolds made their saving throw against my fireball or what have you. And then also it was an opportunity to bring in really solid research in another area, which is the psychology of gambling. And the psychology of random numbers and how we think about them. So this was kind of a running theme through the book, is that there's not whole lot of psychological research that is specifically about tabletop role-playing games. Like there's very few where they did an experiment where they got a group of D&D players and they did the manipulation and they observed the effects and all that sort of stuff. So instead, what I had to do was like pull from other areas of psychology and then say like, well, what are these findings say in the context of playing a TTRPG? And it was really easy to do that for the chapter about dice because, you know, they're literally talking about rolling dice in some of these research. So they studied like gambling and they studied just perceptions of chance and so forth. And like I talk about how there's kind of two main topics or two main fallacies. You know, one is like the gambler's fallacy, where you think like I've rolled, you know, 3 failures in a row. I'm due, like I'm owed. The gods of chance owe me. And thus I think sometimes like literally and out in the open, I think that the next roll has a better chance of being high than it does low because all the previous low rolls. And, you know, I talk about studies where they had people come in and they said, okay, I want you to like simulate a bunch of coin flips by writing down H or T for heads or tails and do like 100 hypothetical coin flips and write down the sequence. And so they would write H, 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 T, H, H, T, T, H, you know, all these sorts of things. And then they said, okay, I want you to talk out loud as you're writing these numbers out. The experimenters said this and like explain why you're deciding to write an H or a T. And they found that like people, if they thought it was a truly random coin flip, would avoid long series of the same result over time. They'd be like, okay, the next one can't be a heads because I wrote heads 5 times previously. So I have to write a T or else it's not going to be random or it's not going to like look random. And they said, you know, we have to alternate. So they would do things like H, T, H, T, H, T over and over and over again. But the truth is that when you look at large distributions of numbers, you get streaks like that, where you might have like several heads in a row. You might have several rolls above 10 in a row on a D20. And it can happen. And it's sort of this belief in the law of small numbers that a small sample of, say, like all of the dice rolls you make over the course of a session, which is probably not that many. Like how many times do you roll a D20 in the course of like a session of D&D? 10, 12? It sort of depends on what's going on, but it's not 100.
Right.
And so you might get streaks of failures just by chance. And that's the way that mathematics works. And then I also talked about a study where people looked at the hot hand fallacy, which is sort of the opposite of the gambler's fallacy, where people think the next roll or the next attempt has to be a failure because there were so many successes, because otherwise it wouldn't be random. And so some researchers looked at like the Philadelphia 76ers basketball team. And I'm happy to bring this episode's sports talk into the conversation. We've got to do it
very
somehow.
Sad about Jared McCain, but
yeah,
it goes 76ers.
So Mike Shea can appreciate it and see, you know, notice me, senpai. I'll say. But they looked at basketball free throws, where people would make free throws, and they looked at streaks of free throws, and they would say like, what's the chances that this person's going to make or miss the next free throw based on how many they had made or missed before. And they thought that like the players themselves thought that they had about a 13% better chance of making a free throw if they had succeeded on the previous one. And 13% in basketball is huge. Like that's game winning, right? Like it could make a big difference. And so this concept of also shows up in D&D, where it's like, I'm due for a success or I'm due for a failure. Because I've rolled a bunch of successes or failures in the past. And what both of these fallacies fail to realize is that every die roll is an independent event that doesn't have any impact on the ones that came before it, won't impact the ones that come after it, won't impact the ones that you make at the same time if you're rolling with advantage. Like they're all independent, and it leads to some wrong predictions. But one of the psychological truisms is that we like to feel like we have control. So people have this illusion of control, and it's comforting to think that it's not just the universe that, you know, is messing with us, but I can actually, you know, do some things to affect it. So Teos, I think the answer to your original question is just embrace the mathematics of it and realize that the universe is cold, uncaring, and it doesn't care about your dexterity saving throw at all.
Thanks for
and
helping
it's just
me
all random.
so much.
Yeah.
The dark, uncaring universe I should embrace.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Speaking of a dark and uncaring universe, I was really interested in reading this as a game designer because as a game designer, sometimes we forget that the people out there who are playing our games have a psychology and prefer things or may have biases or may just have impulses that they're trying to fulfill by playing the game. And so knowing the psychology of our audience can help us be better game designers. So, one of the questions I had, or one of the questions I specifically wanted to see to, was things like, how do we deal with so many in-game choices? And so what did you have to say about that particular question?
That was a fun one to write because I started the chapter off and going through all the choices you have to make if you're creating a level 1 character in the 2024 version of D&D 5e. And it's hundreds. Like if you look at everything, like it's just this bewildering number of choices. And when you start throwing in optional rules like Tasha's and feats and Mordenkainen's, like all of the racial species options that are available there, it's crazy. And like new players, I think often they choke on that sort of stuff, and they need guidance and they need strategies for sort of weeding through those choices and thinking about it. And one of the things that I came across in my research is that people actually say they want more choices. Like, bring in Mordenkainen's and let me choose to be a bugbear or what have you, or have all those other options. But people tend to be more satisfied with their choices when they have fewer choices to choose from. And there was a famous study about jam, like, the thing you spread on toast, in a supermarket where the researchers set up these, tables, and they either presented people with like free samples for a whole bunch of jams. I think it was like 24 different flavors of jams. And then they sort of paid attention to how many people walked up to the table and took a sample. And then they gave them like a coupon code that let them track how many people actually ended up buying one of those jams after sampling it. And then they would rotate between that and having only 6 flavors of jam. So you could come up and you could sample 6 flavors, and then they would track how many people came up and how many people bought something. And they found that people came up and sampled more often when they saw this huge display of 24 flavors, but people bought something more often when they only had to choose between 6 flavors of jam. And they did another study with like college students with extra credit essay assignments where they watched a movie. I think it was like 12 Angry Men, classic movie. And they had to write an essay about it, and they had to choose between one prompt from a list of essay prompts to write their paper. And in one condition, they had a small list of prompts that they could choose from. In another condition, they had a really, really long one. And the assignment was the same. It was like, write an essay based on the prompt you choose. And they found that people completed the assignment more often when they had the limited number of choices. Not only that, but their essays were better when they had to choose from just a few options.
So that's probably like uncertainty on their part, even as they're writing, maybe something like that.
It could be, yeah. Like thinking like maybe I should have chosen one of the other ones, before I locked this in. So it's just kind of an interesting, like contradictory almost idea that people like a lot of choice, but they're do better with less choice. And also in that chapter, I talk about like different strategies people use, like compensatory versus non-compensatory, where compensatory decision-making strategies are when you have like a small number of options and you sort of say like, okay, there's 5 or 6 salient features about this thing, and I'm going to like rate them all, or like numerical, or sort of get an idea of like what the strengths and weaknesses are. And then I'll take everything into account all at once and compare all of the virtues of each option with each other, and then make sort of an informed decision that way. Works pretty well, and that's kind of our go-to when it's a small number of choices. But when you get lots of choices, like which cleric subclass do I want to choose, or which character class do I want to choose when I'm making my character, you may go with something that's more non-compensatory, where you start to like find things that sort of rule options out, to take them off the table entirely. So if you're choosing a class, you may say like, well, I played a bard previously, bard's off the table. Well, I want to play a caster. So anything that's not at least a half caster is off the table. And so that sort of starts reducing the number of choices down. And then you can get it down to something more manageable where you can do a compensatory approach, or maybe just you get down to like 1 or 2 options and the right one is obvious for you. And then I talk about Satisficers versus maximizers. Have you guys heard this term?
No.
These terms? So it's kind of a strategy that people will take when they're given options. They'll either try to satisfice or maximize. And satisficers are ones that look at the options and say, the first one that they come to that's like good enough, they're just like, that one, I'm going to take that. And the ones that are maximizers will be like, okay, that's a pretty good option. Let's put a pin in that. But I also want to explore every other option and every permutation of other things. And I tell the story about how I was DMing a group of players through Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which is one of my favorite published adventures from Wizards. And they get to a point where it's essentially a magic item shop. There's this old guy in the hills and he's in a cave and he's like, hey, give me some gold coins and I can spin them into magic items for you. And I told the players, like, here's an option to buy some magic items with all of the gold that you've got. And this was a decision-making bomb that I threw in the middle of my game that completely derailed, because some people were like, +1 sword, let's go. And those were the Satisficers. And other people were like, okay, let me get my copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide out and look at like every uncommon magic item. And they were like, can I like get back to you on this like in the next session so I can have like a week to like look at my options? I was just like, oh my God, just pick something. Just let's go. I want to like run the rest of the adventure. And I would have done much better to give them like maybe just a list of things where the old guy in the cave said, I can make you any of these things for these prices. And they probably would have been happier with that set of choices and it would have kept things moving. But I had maximizers in the group and they went that direction.
So I'm curious, based on you're talking about these kinds of choices of what do you like more, how have you felt about the Unearthed Arcana playtests, particularly with 2024? Are the things that, as a psychologist, you would say, this could have been done differently?
I'm not sure anything huge jumps out to me beyond just a general feeling that the game is getting more complex with the move from 2014 to 24. Is that you have fewer choices in terms of subclasses, right? Because they culled the number of subclasses for the classes, and there's fewer choices along there. But like mechanically, sort of as you're playing, things get more complex, and seems like you would have more choices because the power scale creep on characters is going to get higher, and then that affects the DM too, because we haven't seen the monster manual yet, but presumably there's going to be a lot more things that monsters can do to compensate for the power creep. So I think the game is getting much, much more complex. And, and I talk about not only the creating your character complexity and choices, but just the moment to moment playing the game when the DM or the GM asks, like, what do you want to do? And you have to answer that question, and you have 12 things you can do. And maybe you were like being a responsible player and trying to decide, in the time leading up to your turn, but now the cleric's standing over there and you have to go back to square one and you have to like figure out what you want to do. So it just gets more complicated, and, house rules or agreements that help simplify things and move things along are probably going to be really valuable.
Yeah.
And to extend this point, you have the overarching question, at least for me, is playing a role-playing game like D&D good for your mental health? And you can answer that, but you weigh that against then this sort of 12-point decision making that you have to make at every table.
Stress.
And does that sort of tactical thing add to or detract from the mental health benefits of playing a role-playing game?
Yeah, and I guess I should start off by again pointing out that like I'm not a therapist. I don't know mental health. That's not my area. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist by education and training. So I know a lot about like the social side and group dynamics and that kind of stuff. And then I brought in the consumer stuff. This book is
Psychology of 9 Inch Nails, right?
Yeah. So this book is not like how to improve your mental health through playing D&D, how not to be like a therapeutic game master, which is a term used to describe very real people who use role-playing games to treat patients. Because I'm not that, you guys aren't that, the vast majority of the people playing the game are not that. But I do have a little bit of information in there, about half a chapter about therapeutic DMing and mental health. And then I have a chapter in there about like using D&D to relieve stress and escapism. There's a whole chapter in there about that, of like what's the function and the benefit of escaping into imaginary worlds and to reduce stress and all of that sort of stuff. So, Shawn, I think that the idea of like the stress of playing the game in the moment, of where you're having to decide what to do, first of all, that's going to like vary from table to table, right? Because some people are more forgiving and it's cool if you take time, or if you're learning, or what have you. But generally, that's not going to weigh on your mental health. I wouldn't think as much as some other kinds of stress, because you're still doing it for the purpose of interacting with people and having fun and all that stuff. Which is not to say that, you know, playing a very high stakes game couldn't be stressful. Playing for an audience, such as at a convention or on a web stream, couldn't be stressful. I think I had an idea for like the psychology of like the audience effect and playing in front of a crowd in an early draft of the book, but I took it out to make room for some other stuff. But yeah.
One thing you did look at, though, was online play versus in-person play. And you kind of asked whether it's as satisfying as beneficial if you're online or in person. So what did you find? I'm very curious about that one.
Yeah, that was very close to home, because I mentioned before that I started playing with a group back in like 2011. And there are some people in that group that were in there. They're in my current group that were in my 2011 group. Like, I've been playing with these people for that long. And people have come and gone and so forth. But we were having a great time playing along. And then the game came to like a stumbling halt in March of 2020, which you guys may remember a little thing called the pandemic and the shutdown that happened around that time. And we were like, oh, we'll take a week off. And then, oh, I don't think things are going to change very quickly. And so we kind of then pivoted to playing online. So I had this group of people that I played with in person for years and years. And then we started playing online. And in the course of playing online, like 3 of them moved away to like different parts of the country. We added another person to the group who was in Wyoming, so far away from the rest of us. But we all kept playing online. And so it was a really interesting idea of like, well, what's the difference between online and in-person play? And which one, you know, do I prefer? I think the answer is pretty easy, that I prefer in person, but like, I do play online because that's just sort of the reality that I have. And so I looked at like some of the stressors and some of the weirdness that comes from playing online all the time. And at the time I was working from home. So I would sit in this office that you're seeing, if you're watching the video version of this, for 8, 9, some days 10 hours working, sitting on Zoom calls for good chunks of that time. And then on Fridays, after doing that for a week, Fridays was our game night. And then I would come and I would sit on a 3 to 4 hour Zoom call, Discord call, video conference call, where I would just keep doing it. And eventually I kind of had to back out of that group because it was just like too much time spent in that mode. And so I looked at some of the research on what they're calling like video conference fatigue that started to come up after everything moved online and remote work. And there's just a lot that happens when you're staring at little Brady Bunch style squares of people on a screen. And it's just not the way that we have evolved to take in information, to think, to perceive. Like, it just runs counter to a lot of like those cognitive functions. For example, like we're sitting here right now and I can look at like Shawn's face. And if I wanted Shawn's face as big in my field of view as it appears now on a video call, he would have to be like inches from my face to be like that big. So part of my brain is saying like, wow, this dude is standing really close to me right now. It's kind of in my personal space. And then when you're on a video call, and a lot of games don't even use video, they might just use audio, you lose out on a lot of nonverbal communications. You can't see facial expressions, hand gestures, especially if you're just looking at people from the chest up. You don't see what they're doing with other parts of their body, which normally gives you a lot of contextual information and a lot of communication to what's going on. So you have to rely on just what you can see and tone of voice, and you lose a lot of that nonverbal kind of stuff. There's social norms around like getting up and moving. If you're at an in-person table, it's pretty normal to like stand up and go to the kitchen and refill your drink, or walk around the side of the table to grab, the snacks. But in like a video call, if you like stand up and move out of frame, everybody's like, wait, what happened to Jamie? Did we lose Jamie? Where'd he go? Jamie, are you still there? And you're like, yeah, I'm here. I'm just like letting the dog out. So it just sort of messes with like things that we're used to. And I think there could be an argument that you will get used to those things over time and exposure, but that may be an individual thing. And it's just psychologically taxing to play in that way and interact with a video conference mediated technology getting in the way. And then the other thing I looked at for that chapter of in-person versus online gaming is the different kinds of social capital that we accrue. And this is kind of like going into the neighboring field of sociology, but they have this idea of social capital, which are the benefits that you get from being a member of a group, right? So you could be a part of your family, your workplace, your, whatever groups they are. These are social capital is what you get out of being in that group. And there tend to be like two different types of social capital they talk about. Like bonding tends to provide like more emotional support and tangible favors. So it's like getting a ride to the airport, or help moving a couch, or, listen to me because my girlfriend just broke up with me and I want somebody to talk to about it. And so you get mostly that from family and really close friends. And then there's bridging social capital, which helps you make connections and get exposed to different types of people and different ideas that are outside of your normal bubble. So these might be like the clubs and the groups that you're a part of, which you get to go and you get to see people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different values, et cetera, et cetera. And you get to interact with those people and find out what they're about. And there is a lot of research done, again, not on tabletop role-playing games, but on video games, of online video games, and what kind of social capital people get when they are playing with friends, or they're part of an online guild or something like that. And they found that when you play online in that way, you tend to get more of the bridging social capital. So it's great for like getting exposed to different kinds of people. It might be great for finding somebody that could recommend you for a job, or that you're like, hey, I'm looking for a handyman. Can anybody like recommend somebody? That kind of thing. And you get less bonding social capital of that emotional and tangible favors.
Wow.
And so I make the argument that when you play in person, you get more bonding social capital. And when you play D&D online, you get more of the bridging. Both are good, right? Like both are benefits, but they're different. So I think ultimately the answer to the question of which is better, well, I think the ultimate answer is that any D&D is better than no D&D, right? So if that's like your only option, then that's the better way to play. But that otherwise they're different. And they get you different things. And there's lots of benefits to playing online with VTTs, where everything is integrated and you can auto roll and look up rules and all that sort of stuff. And there's great things about being in person. Like you get to leave this room that I am in to go play some D&D and interact with other people. Yeah. So take what you can get, but maybe be aware and try to mitigate some of the shortcomings.
That's awesome.
Awesome. Wow. All right, we are coming up on our time here. Teos, did you have any last questions?
I mean, yes, but also I don't want to keep you forever. But it's really fascinating. I mean, I love that we can think about this way. And now I'm kind of wanting to take everything I see, like now I want to go back and talk about the Artificer and say, like, in terms of the psychology of it, right? What should it be? And what questions should we ask the playtesters? it's really very fascinating way to look at it. And I love this kind of like behavioral science type of analysis of things too. So I love the topic.
Well, there's a whole book of it for you.
I'm going to get it.
And there's a whole website of it at psychologyofgames.com, as well as psychologyofdnd.com.
Yeah.
So we're going to do our closing, but we're going to give you a chance, Jamie, to tell everybody where to find your stuff after that.
Got it.
So in closing, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did enjoy this episode and you would like to help us out, you can do so by joining our Patreon. You can become a Master of Dungeon supporter. We thank you for that. In our show notes, we give a special shout out to our Master of Realm supporters. And the Masters of the Multiverse, well, they get their names read right now. Agile Monk of Fantasy Companion Workshops. Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios. Craig Bailey, Dave Bastiansen, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Calvin Bridges of Alos. Evil John, Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at NerdRonomicon.com, and James Fisher, Scott Fitzgerald Gray of Insane Angel Studios, Will Harshman of Runeforge Tabletop Gaming, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Shawn Hurst, Mark and Mary's Gaming Compound, The Mighty Jerd, JR of The Twilight Perspective, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, Paul Mata, The Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, Anna B. Meyer of Fantasy Cartography, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson, creator of the Deck of Player Safety, Mighty Zeus, Phil Wirt from Page, the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, Frog Prince at Tentacles Squelching Wetly, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Pugnus, Ozymandias Rex, Rudder Rick, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Andy Shockney, Krishna Shamosa, Spark from Dunner Games, Josh and Liwanika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast, Talos the Stormlord, Jeremy Talaman from the D&D and TV podcast, Tres, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Jason Ward from Accidental Cyclops Games, Javier Waziak, Chris Webster, Zach Types, and Walt Winfrey. Thank you so much for your support. You can become a patron by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. Whew. Teos, where can people find you?
Find me at alphastream.org. This week I should have a video on the last of my DMG reviews because I've got to turn my attention to the monster manual and everything there. Can't tell you what I'm seeing, but in the future. But this week, I'm going to try to tackle my last topic, exploration, and what the DMG in 2024 tells us about.
Awesome. And Jamie, if people want to follow your work or buy your book, where can they do that?
So the best place is probably psychologyofgames.com. That's where I put everything. You can find the stuff that I write about tabletop role-playing games and also video games. And if you just want the TTRPG stuff, it's Psychology of D&D. That's D with an N instead of an ampersand, D.com. And that's kind of just the D&D or TTRPG stuff there. But if you go to either of those, you can find a preview of the book. There's like the whole table of contents, so you can see like all the questions that I attempt to answer. And then you can also listen to excerpts from the audiobook version of the book for free is there as well to get kind of an idea about that. I think the guy that did the narration was great. Delivered the line "Rawr, I'm a Velociraptor" just perfectly, exactly the way that I heard it in my head when I wrote those words. If you go there, and you can also find out socials, like I'm Jamie Madigan on Blue Sky, for example. I've got an account on that other social media site that I don't use anymore. But Blue Sky is where I'm doing most of my chit-chatting. And Psychology of Games or Psychology in D&D are links there to find the book. It's called The Psychology of Dungeons and Dragons. What's the subtitle? How to be a better, more engaged, and happier player or game master. And you can find that wherever you order books online. And if you go to a brick and mortar store, they might have it. Sometimes they'll have it. They could certainly order it for you. And that's probably true of your local gaming shop as well. But if you tell them that you want it, they can order it for you there. Or you can buy it online wherever you buy books online.
There you go. I've already listened to it and read it online. So I'm
Nice.
going to have the trifecta soon when I have the physical copy. And of course, you can find me on social media at Shawn Merwin, and you can follow the podcast at Mastering D&D on those socials as well. So Teos, Jamie, we are now masters not only of dungeons, but of Dungeons and
mind.
Dragons psychology. What are we going to do now?
I'm going to go play some D&D.
That's great. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm going to go wait for Teos's to release all the secrets of the monster manual.
Oh, yeah. No, I'll send them to you via no mechanism known to people, because I can't.
Okay. By an artificer's special.
Eldritch
It only
Hand.
lasts an hour, so hurry up.
Yeah, I'll give you
That's
temporary
what all
hit
those
points.
drones are. Teos delivering secrets.
That's right.